All right, recording in progress. I guess I'll do a brief introduction here. So this is the Association for Rational Thought, though we're cross-listed on a couple of other groups, and we're about to enjoy another presentation from Valeria Rudman-Melnick. I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you'll do your credits better than I can. But it's a very interesting topic today on the dimorphism between the sexes of the human brain. So, Valeria, I turned it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good morning. And I'm very grateful for you gathering this morning to listen to the presentation. Just as a brief introduction, I'm a research scientist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. My main field is not neuroscience, it's kidney disease research, but I'm also interested in a wide array of topics, particularly those which are about the nature of human consciousness and sentience. And I recently stumbled upon some data which had been summarizing the three decades of human brain research. And they were looking into the morphological differences between sexes' brain. And I thought it was worth pursuing because this topic is very pertinent to many important areas, such as practically recorded cognitive differences between the sexes. And for example, in terms of the field of choice of study, when people graduate from colleges and choose their majors. So that's the reason why I chose that topic. Should we just go, or do you want to say
Yeah, I
something?
yeah, I would say let's go. I think I will offer you the opportunity to advertise your own group, which is a different meetup group that I enjoy attending regularly. So
Oh, yes. So thank you for that. We have our own American Atheist and Agnostic Society, which is already more than a year old. We started it in summer of, I think, 2022, and now it has over 260 members. So it's kind of been an interesting journey, and I thank everyone who is a member of that society too for participation. We usually gather once or twice a month. Usually it's on Tuesday because that appears to be the preference of most members. And we discuss topics which are relevant to not only science, but just general atheist related questions such as history. And for example, one of the future meetings I would like to dedicate to the discussion of what we recently observe in society, and I see it as a dangerous trend of removing the monuments and statues of people from the past. I find it very concerning because I myself come from the country which had a communist tragedy in its history. And that was one of the first signs. And I don't like it very much because it's like the early sign of plague when you just have that red staining over the skin. But soon after that, the disease is going to become mortal. So there was this recent attempt to remove the statue of William Penn from Penn's Park, and that didn't sound good to me. So I would like to have a discussion about what people kind of are unhappy with, like what is behind this desire. I have some of my own hypotheses, but I would always like to hear from the people, and particularly from young people, because it appears to be the most popular in the age group around 18, 24 years old. But
we did speak to my daughter last night, and she is definitely interested in inviting some of her friends. So we'll need to arrange
yeah,
for that.
yeah, that would be great. And I think we can discuss the date for that later. But
So
I think
please, let's go ahead and do dimorphism of the brain.
yes, of course. So I'm going to start full screen now because I think we're done with introduction. So the paper which I'm basing my presentation on, of course, there's going to be some other papers from when it's needed, but the main paper is called Dump the Dimorphism, Comprehensive Synthesis of Human Brain Studies, Reveals Few Male-Female Differences Beyond Size. So what's important about that is that there had been studies about this topic for a long time. Particularly, this research kind of summarizes the meta-synthesis of 3 decades of these findings. But the problem was that all of these individual studies, they were small. Like, for example, that particular hospital has several MRI data, and they are trying to make conclusion from them, but the number of subjects might be like 30 or 50, which is definitely not enough for big population scale conclusions. So this synthesizes all of the research available for the recent 3 decades, and we can begin going through the figures. So it is known, first of all, we can start from basic definitions. So we know that sex stands for inflexible biological components, and these are, first of all, chromosomes. That's something which the human has from the stage of formation of the zygote, and um, it stays with them. And then, of course, based upon the genes which are encoded in the chromosomes, they get hormones, and then they get reproductive organs, secondary sexual characteristics, which are present from birth too, but then they develop in puberty. And then we have the term which is called gender, and it's a debatable term whether or not it exists, it's separate from sex or not, but what it stands for is a psychological manifestation. So it's mostly how the person identifies, how they behave, and the social role which they exhibit. And of course, this feature is, unlike sex, very dependent on the society and very dependent on what is expected, and can even change within the same societies when these societies go through different phases. Like everyone knows that usually in times of wars, women abandon their normal, more socially oriented professions and go to manufacturing and everything because it's just what the society requires at the moment. And there is also a very interesting trend, which the paper presented, regarding the male to female ratio of certain psychiatric disorders. And we can see that there is a very clear sex difference in terms of the prevalence of certain diseases. So, for example, we have much more ADHD, autism, alcohol use disorder, and dyslexia among men, while women prevail in anxiety spectrum disorders, depression, and eating disorders. And this is a trend which actually drives interest to many of these brain studies, because it appears to be a clear binary that like women and men have different signatures of the psychiatric conditions. And what is more interesting, it's not from that paper, it's from another analysis. So there was this nationwide study of IQ differences between the sexes, and it found that in many skills, like not even typically thought like more specific for women, like reading or something, in many of these IQ skills, which are tested throughout this quiz, until the age of 14, girls are either not worse or even slightly better than boys. But starting from the age 16 and 17, the trend reverses. So boys become better by several points. It's not a big difference, but it is a difference. And girls start losing these points. And that's another question which drives all of these studies. Like what is in the morphology of the brain which might expect which might underlie these observed differences. And the important question is that when you're studying something, it doesn't have to be brain anatomy, it has to be anything. But when you're studying a parameter, you have to always make adjustment for the general body size, because otherwise the comparison would just make no sense. And that's what had been rarely done, especially in the systematic manner, when the observed morphological differences in the brain, for example, differences in overall brain weight, would be normalized to the weight of the whole body. And that's like the first basic thing which we do. For example, in my studies, when I want to measure the intensity of expression of certain gene or certain protein, I can't just present the absolute numbers. I always have to normalize them to the overall basic level of gene expression or protein expression in that particular sample, and then normalize my target to that, because otherwise a comparison would lack validity. And just some basic definitions about what we're going to be talking about. So there is total intracranial volume, and that stands for just everything which is inside the skull, not only the nervous tissue by itself, but everything else which is present there, including blood vessels, connective tissue, fat tissue, and there is also total brain volume, TBV, which actually stands for just the volume of the brain without everything else. And we also have to not forget that there is a thing called cerebrospinal fluid, because we talked in one of our lectures about the consciousness, that brain of the humans has a system of ventricles inside it. And these ventricles contain this fluid, which is called CSF, cerebrospinal fluid, and it also has to be taken into account.
Larry,
So, yes?
may I ask, just to clarify, so does total brain volume exclude is it ventricle? Ventricle? I can't remember can't think of the word all of a sudden. Does it include or exclude those volumes within the?
So it actually includes that. So what it excludes is everything which is around the brain. So it excludes the blood vessels, it excludes the connective tissue around the brain and the fat tissue, but it still has the CSF volume. So it's just an additional thing which you have to look at separately.
So as you have them listed there, the cerebral fluid is a subset of the total brain, which is a sub.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, yes, you're welcome. So they've looked at the 2014 meta-analysis, looked at 77 studies with more than 15,000 patients. And what they found is that intracranial volume is 12% larger in males, and so is the cerebral spinal fluid taken separately as a total brain volume. And total brain volume, so all of these three parameters are larger in males. And the similar findings was from the UK Biobank study results. So total brain volume was 10.6% larger in males. And that was actually a very good indication, because the fact that this meta-analysis was replicative of the UK Biobank study by merely like 0.2% percent point seems like that's a replicable result. So,
Larry,
yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt again, but someone's asking in chat, essentially, those numbers that you have there, is that already normalized by the body size or not yet?
No. Now we're talking about just the, wait.
Raw numbers.
Yes, here we're talking about the raw numbers, when you don't take into account the body weight, the
Okay.
overall body weight. So then later there was another study which reported another brain volume review. So it starts being about 8% larger in actually male neonates. So it's present from the very beginning. And it increases to 13% when people reach adolescence and early adulthood. So this appears to be present in many different studies, and you can also compare not just the total brain volume, but you can compare, for example, total gray matter and total white matter. And the other study reported that these parameters are also larger in males than in females. If you,
Valerian, I'm sorry.
yes.
I seem to have become chat moderator, so
No, it's all right. It's all right. Anytime
so I
you're
will
welcome.
interrupt on everyone's behalf.
Yes, of course. You're welcome to interrupt anytime. I'm not bothered with that.
I appreciate that. So David was asking whether that the brain body size correlation, does that hold for all primates? No.
For priming,
Yeah, for primates in general, is there a similar correlation between brain? If David, if I'm asking your question correctly, you can clarify.
No, that's true. I mean, one might ask, I think that's Marwitz's question as well. One pulls that correlation between brain size and body size. in general, but that may not hold across species, but one suspects it would hold across primates. Is that
Yes.
found?
So I would expect that too. I know that in primates, in most species, males are larger than females. There are other mammals where it's reversed, but in primates, that's the case. So I would expect that the brain patterns would also follow.
Okay, but there's no data on whether the brain size, body size correlation holds there.
Well, I don't know if there is data or there is not, but I can look this up because this study focuses only on the humans. So if that's something of the interest, I can look up the studies which look at particularly that. Actually, you know what, we might end up touching this topic anyway, because one of my next lectures was planned to be about evolution of brain development in humans. And based upon what I've seen in the chapter of the book, I think that it will provide at least some insights on that. But I'll look it up separately.
Thank you.
Be able to give more informed answer. So, but then there was another longitudinal imaging study of 387 adolescents. And they also observed a similar trend that the sex or gender differences in total brain volume, they grow from the time of early childhood, age 7, to post-puberty, which is age 20. And that also happens in parallel with a divergence in height and weight. So technically speaking, what all of these studies observe is that these differences in total brain volume or total intracranial volume, they parallel the changes of height and weight differences. But this is not even the most fascinating finding. I find the more fascinating the next bullet point. So it appears that in brain, these percentages of differences are smaller than in pretty much all other organs which they looked at. And some of these organs are very surprising. So the difference in heart is 17%. The difference in lung is 23. Liver 14, pancreas 18, kidney 19, and thyroid is 25% difference. So what I have to say from my own experience is that I work with the kidney, and yes, male mice kidney are much larger than females. I would agree with that 19% presented data. But the thing is that when we model diseases in male and female mice, to model, let's say, ischemic damage, in the male, I have to just do 30 minutes of ischemia when I clamp the renal vessel for 30 minutes. If I do the same in the female mouse and then analyze the kidney morphology, there would be I wouldn't be able to guess that injury was even induced. So to injury females to comparable levels with males, I have to do almost twice as long of ischemia as for the males. So we have to remember that like larger organ size doesn't definitely speak for functionality. It might just be simply reflective of the overall size of the body. But what is particularly noticeable is that brain appears to be the least affected by that overall body height and weight change. So, and so this other parameter which we talked about, gray matter to white matter ratio, it's 47% larger actually in females than in males. But then again, when you normalize it to total brain volume, it becomes smaller. So these parameters, these are just the overall parameters which we've talked about. But then the paper focused on several specific aspects, not just on the plain morphology, but on more functional aspects. And the reason why they've done it is because we, again, know that these disorders like ADHD, depression, have clear sex or gender difference. So researchers were asking what might be standing behind that and whether or not there are differences not on the physiological level, but on the function level. And also, so to add back to all of these discussions, so these were just volumes. So there was another interesting point made in the study when they did what they called blind MRI testing. And what it was that they were giving people samples of female versus male MRIs, and trying to ask them whether or not they can tell one from another. So when the overall brain volume was in the picture, almost everyone was able to guess. But interesting, when they omitted the overall brain volume, the frequency of the correct guess versus incorrect became like in the flipping coin test. So technically speaking, when these analysis were given the weight, they were able to tell, but when they weren't, it was just a mere guess, because there is no major morphological characteristics which can tell if it's a female brain or a male brain on the gross morphology. So when you're looking at an MRI picture, you wouldn't be able to distinguish one from another unless you have the overall volume reading. So that's why they started later. They started the next step. They started looking at more functional aspects, and they looked at several of them, and one is language processing. So we know that there are areas of the brain specifically dedicated for language processing, and they're highlighted right here on the picture. We know that there is anterior speech area, which is called Broca's area, and we know that there is a posterior area, which is Wernicke's area, and they are both responsive. And there is, of course, a connectome between them. And we know from the lesion studies that when you injure the posterior area, the patient is capable of producing speech which sounds very cohesively and is nicely organized in sentences, but it totally lacks sense. So what it's called is word salad. Basically, the patient speaks very clearly. It's kind of artistic, but what they say has absolutely no meaning. While in the case of damaging... Sorry, what? Sorry?
I think that was background noise.
Oh, okay. All right. So, and when there is a damage in the anterior area, the symptoms are kind of reversed. The patient is aware of what they want to say, and they say things which are sensical. However, they lack ability to form connected sentences. Like they can't organize their thought into a cohesive sentence. So it's known that traditionally women perform better on the tasks which are related to speech and reading, and it's known from many school tests and assessments which had been looked at, and they looked further. So what they've done was called functional MRI, which means that you conduct MRI analysis while the subject is performing one of the language processing related tasks. And these tasks were, for example, verb generation. When you're asked to, when you, for example, you're given a word like, let's say, see, and you're asked to generate 5 or more words which would be related to the word see, or you have to do verbal working memory when you're given the word and you have to kind of produce the associations with that. So they've done functional MRI during the time when the subjects were performing these tasks. And they've compared what will be the activation mode, so where you would see the signal on the MRI. And as you can see in the tables which summarize the results of this study, everything which found no specific differences in male versus female or female to male activation, they're highlighted in yellow. So you can see that a lot of these studies found that basically there were no differences in functional MRI images while men versus women were performing these tasks. And as you can tell from the numbers of the subject, actually, these numbers are better than what one could expect. Like we have enough test subjects in some of them. So that was the data regarding that. And there was also other verbal tasks which were not those 3 which we discussed before. And oh, sweetie pie, I think I can't switch my, oh, okay, I can, yeah. So we talked about the verbal fluency, verb generation, verbal working memory. They did some other tasks as well, and here are the results. And as you can see, it appears that there is no clear pattern of, like, let's say, this is what happens in the males, and this is what happens in the women, so that it would be conclusive towards certain female to male difference. And then, so just to discuss like what particularly we're talking about. So verbal fluency would be when we are asking the subjects to quickly name as many words as possible that would begin with the same letter, for example, letter B, or we can ask them some other criteria, like, for example, four-legged animals, or how many rivers you can name. And it's known from the meta-analytic studies, as we talked before, that usually on the verbal fluency, women outperform men by the significant enough value. So just these were the bullet points from the tables which we looked at. So of these 6 functional MRI studies, which included 7 independent samples, it was expected that there would be some differences, but it appears that 3 of them reported no difference in brain activation at all. And 3 others found some differences, some divergence in male to female activation patterns. However, these brain locations and direction of differences, they were different among these studies themselves. So again, as I said, it appears that we cannot find a clearly distinguishing functional pattern in the brain activation during the verbal tasks, which would confidently differ men from women.
So, Valeria,
Yes.
so the takeaway is there are statistically significant differences in performance on these verbal tests.
Yes.
But there is
Yes.
not a consistent picture, a morphological explanation.
Yes,
from
absolutely,
activation.
absolutely correct. We can say that there is very statistically significant, and it's not just from that one study. It's if you look at, I've looked at the SAT results for a long time, and it usually the pattern is that men are better at math and spatial oriented analysis and everything related to that than women, while women are better at reading and interpretation. So this is not just from that meta-analysis by Hyde and Lin from 1988. If you look at SAT results for many decades, that would be the pattern. So yes, we can confidently say that there is a functional difference, but there is no identified morphological pattern which would underlie that. So next they looked at what we know as spatial cognition, and just from the results of the SAT test and from what we'll discuss, here it's reversed. Here it's men outperform women, and spatial cognition skills include visualization, perception, and mental rotation. And we will talk about some of them in a more detailed examples and later, so we will be able to know what mental rotation test is. So they found that some early meta-analysis studies in the 1985 and 1995, they found that males outperform females in all of these domains, including visualization, perception, and mental rotation. However, the difference is, well, I wouldn't say that it's smaller than the difference which the studies reported for the verbal skills, but it's still, I would say, the difference is present. And what these studies found was consistent to what I said before, that these significance started in the post-puberty, particularly after 18 years of age in these studies. In the studies from other group which were analyzing these nationwide IQ data, the differences in IQ became significant after the age of 16. And these differences were also favoring men. So for the spatial perception and for mental rotation, these differences were larger. And they were larger with more recently done meta-analysis. And they also did the test in the skill which is called spatial navigation. And they also found the difference which was favoring males. So, and these differences were also smaller in children and they were always growing larger towards the adulthood, and particularly after the puberty. So now, what some other initial studies found is that they identified that there was greater activation in left parietal and posterior temporal areas for men, and we can see here in the picture where we have the parietal lobe and temporal lobe. And this was during a two-dimensional mental rotation task, or MRT. But there were no neural differences in the 8-year-old boys and girls. So now we're going to look at what particularly these mental rotation tasks are. So when you're asked...
So in this case, the takeaway is there's a performance difference and there was an identifiable activation difference.
Yes. This particular study found that there was higher activation in these left parietal and posterior temporal lobe for men compared to women. So here we have some data which suggests that there is a difference in this particular skill. Unlikely with the verbal tasks, but so moving forward, what is this mental rotation test? That's one of the examples of that. So when you're given a subject, and I recently did some IQ test for myself just for fun, and it indeed is included there, this kind of tasks. So you have to look at this and answer the questions about, like, for example, what is similar and what is different in how they are located, and you have to identify certain underlying patterns among these locations, among how these gingerbread men figures are situated. Or let's say you would be given just 2 of them, and you'll be asked to put the third one into the correct position according to the logic of these stuff. And so this is the raw data from one of these studies, and they looked at subjects with respect to their age, not only just adult men and women, definitely post-pubertal, but also they looked at boys and girls. If I remember correctly, they were like early school age, between 7 and 10 years old. So they've looked at 2 parameters. They've looked at the number of correct answers given totally, and they've looked also at the reaction time, like, for example, how long it would take from one person to answer the question. And they found that so we have men and women, boys and girls, with these color codes here. So they found that among so these graphs didn't find, if you can see, and they also looked at like different angles when they are located at, let's say, 90 degrees to 170, 180. Sorry, what? Was it a question or is just a noise?
Maybe if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself so that we don't get any background noise. Thank you.
Yeah, because every once in a while I hear that someone is trying to say something and I think that they might be trying to ask a question. But here, as you can see, this study didn't find significant difference in the number of correctly answered questions. There was a trend down in the girls in the total correct answers, but if you look at the questions by different degrees, you see that actually the differences are very small. But then what they've looked at next was the total reaction time, which means at the time which the subjects took to answer the question. And here is where the differences were present. And you can see that men were able to answer questions faster, and that was same in both age groups. It was correct for men versus women, and that was also correct for boys versus girls. And that was kind of consistent throughout all of the degrees analyzed, starting from 0 to 270 and 180 and 90.
Do you know, is that time just for correct answers?
No, I don't think so. I think that this upper graph is the overall number of correct answers, but this is just the reaction time of no matter whether.
That just says men are hasty.
Yes. So that says that like how quickly you answer the question. I don't think that in that study they did it specifically for just correct answers. And obviously that bottom gingerbread picture is just for fun. I looked out for scary gingerbread men, and I thought that that was scary enough. So
There's a question in the chat here. Michelle says, I wonder if the results will have similar results if these studies were conducted in other regions other than English speaking, first world countries or Western cultures, basically different societal norms. Do
I
that's
think
been evaluated at
yeah.
all?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the answer might be different. And the reason why I'm thinking it might is because there was that study which analyzed the frequency of STEM professions in men versus women throughout the world. And what they found was quite a surprising trend that the higher proportion of women in STEM was actually not in countries like US or England or Europe. It was in countries which were more like Turkey, Mexico. And I think I know why is that. It's because like when you are, I actually think it's not a surprising thing, because when you are in, let's say, developed economy with abundance of choices and not that much pressure, you might select options which are maybe more interesting but less intense. And in countries where there is more societal pressure on people, more expectations from the parents, and less ways to prosperity, women more often select STEM because they kind of understand that this is their only way, for example, out of poverty or like out of unwanted marriage or something else. So it kind of creates the pressure which makes people use more of their capacities or develop these capacities better. So I would be interested in seeing whether or not these tests were done in other countries. However, I would say that the IQ difference holds more or less, at least cross-racially in America, because if you look at these SAT data, when they're broken down, the race and gender, yes, gender-related differences are smaller in Asian students. They're actually much smaller than in all other racial groups, but they're still present. So there is still some difference in at least these tasks. So what they've tried to look at next was they've tried to do electroencephalography or EEG in these areas which we discussed before. So we talked about posterior temporal and left parietal lobes, right? So here they've looked at the electroencephalography to, that's how the trend was confirmed. And they actually found that these differences were expectantly much more significant in adults. You can see that in both graphs, in the posterior temporal lobe and in the parietal lobe, the differences were huger. The differences in the EEG outputs were huger in the adults, and they were almost not present in the kids. And all of these results, like both functional and physiological, like EEG, what this tells me is that it appears that something critical happens during the puberty, because that would be the only explanation for why in the younger children and the prepubertal children, these differences are almost not detectable while they become so significant in adults. And my explanation for that is that these probably are effects of the hormones, which are released during the puberty, and they underlie all of these functionally observed effects. And maybe that's why we see not that much differences on like pure morphology, on how neurons are organized, on like general brain anatomy, but we see differences in the activations and in the certain tasks.
Valeria, do you know, I mean, another statistical possibility I could conceive of is what if the differentiation gradually grows with age, but the age range of children is smaller than the age range of adults. And so if you're sampling a wider range of adults, you're going to pick up more of that difference than the other. In other words, is it necessarily puberty, or could it be a sample of ages sort of thing? Do we know whether that's
I wouldn't
been
think
determined?
I wouldn't think that, because when you're designing the study, you're supposed to account for these differences. Like if you have just 10, let's say you have 10 boys, but you have 50 men. Then when you're putting out your final data on the graph, and this is obviously an old study, I can see that just by the shape of these graphs, because today they're making us showing all of the individual replicates. Like they wouldn't be able to just demonstrate the bar plots with, I would say, a standard error of the mean. But as you can see, their standard errors of the mean are quite small, and they're small in all the groups. But not even that, like you wouldn't be able to just compare like absolute number if you have 5 boys versus 50 men. You would have to normalize that to the subject number.
Right.
Like
The small variation is a good point, but actually what I was thinking was even if you had 50 boys ages 6 to 8 and 10 men ages 30 to 90.
okay, I see the point. But I think that here age ranges weren't that large. I think most of the test subjects were like 20 to 40.
Okay.
So it's
Anyway,
not
I
that
did
they,
just occurred to me when you were talking about
yeah,
saying it's puberty, do we know that was my question. But that's fine.
yeah, I get your point. I get your point, and I think it's definitely worth exploring. But then there would be, then with that you can bring in another factor, like becoming more senior. Sometimes people start like their intellectual capacities, their cognitive skills also change with age. So then
Justify.
you have to also discern that possibility, that if you're adding like men from 20 to 60, then you also have to think about how that would drive your statistics down. But if I remember the method section correctly, these men and women were like 20 to 30 most age group, and the children were 7 to 10. So that was not actually that high of an age variation. But the bigger thing which drives me to thinking that it's all about puberty are these national IQ test results, when like it was clearly reversing the trend, like in the age groups of 10, 12, 13 years old, girls were either as good as boys or better, but then this reversed.
Yeah, and your standard deviations on there also, I think, belie my theory, because if there was a greater variation because there's a greater adult a range of ages, I would expect the variation to be bigger on that population too.
Yeah, that could be, but what I'm glad to see is that their standard error of the mean or standard deviation, whatever they have here, they appear to be small in all of their graphs, not only for these electroencephalography data, but also for like the functional results per se, which means that at least their variability was low
Right.
from the subject to subject. So, but these are all really good questions. Thank you. So they've done another test for this mental rotation skill evaluation. As you can see, the previous ones were 2D. They were two-dimensional. And they decided to do a more complicated task where this was 3D, and did the same analysis. First of all, they looked at the percentage of the correct answers, and here they observed that while in their study there was no difference in response to the two-dimensional mental rotation between men and women, but there was a differences favoring men in the three-dimensional mental rotation test. And what I'm actually also thinking about is what it might be related to is like the games when the children are playing. you know, a lot of these skills, for example, I learned my English language when I was still in a preschool. So in a preschool, it's a really good time to learn skills, which you will have much harder time learning later in life. And what I'm thinking, what might be explaining these differences is that girls usually get toys which are more, I would say, socially oriented, like dolls or stuffed animals, and like their play is usually more about like human interaction, while boys usually get all of these Lego kits and stuff like this. And I think that due to this, without even knowing that, you might be kind of trained for being better at all of the mental, all of the spatial analysis tasks, because like when you're building castles, when you're building, you know, spaceships and all that stuff, you are training exactly that. Like this looks to me very similar to these Lego blocks. And if you're doing that when you're an early young child, without even like knowing that you're learning the skills, and then it of course creates a huge difference in the outcome. So I think that this is also another possibility worth exploring. Any thoughts on that? I think whoever is talking is muted, but the question was like, do you have any input on that possibility?
I think it's a crime that little boys are more likely to get Legos as a gift based on that information.
Yeah, I would be interested in like, how is it in Americans? Like, is it typical that people buy like sex-specific toys?
Actually, yes, but I think it's California that just passed the law. Stores of a certain size have to have a gender-neutral section in the toy store or something.
Yeah, actually, I think that that might be the exact reason, because no brainer, if I wasn't like told to learn English when I was 5 years old, no brainer, I would have much less of the skill now. Because the older you get, the harder it becomes to even like change, even like your basic learning capacity. So they also.
I'm going to butcher this person's name. I apologize. Diaw, Dial Sankara. Anyway, says in the chat,
Yeah.
are women socialized to self-doubt and men to be more assertive? And could this societal influence impact IQ tests during puberty when gender differences are emphasized?
I think that this is a really good point, because I've heard from people who are not known to be social justice warriors or something, that like when they look at grants, they usually observe that women are more self-censoring. Like, for example, I would dump 10 out of 10 of my grants before submitting one, because I think that they're all just garbage and they need to be redone from the very beginning. While they said that, yes, they observe that men might be more self-confident. Like they would think that whatever is produced is worth marketing as in a shape as it is right now, which I don't definitely think that that's a good or bad thing, because like after 12 censorship versions, my grants are going to be really good and they will have higher chance of funding. And the fact that I like self-criticizing doesn't definitely mean that I'm going to have a worst product. But I think the point here is very important, that it might be some of that might account for the self-confidence difference in the sexes. So these were the verbal and spatial analysis skills. The last parameter the study looked at was the emotion processing. And I know that emotions by themselves raise huge amount of conversation about how different sexes are emotional in different ways. However, they've looked at these studies summarized in the table, and it appears that both men and women activate similar areas of their brains when they're processing emotions. And these areas include amygdala, hippocampus, thalamus, midbrain, and frontal lobe. And we can talk about every single part of that separately. So what amygdala is, it is a small area in the brain which is particularly responsible for long and short-term emotion processing, and for also what is called emotional memory, like when you are remembering your feelings regarding a certain event. Hippocampus is an area which is responsible mostly for memory, but also it appears that this study finds that it gets activated when you are processing emotions. Thalamus, we had a lot of talk about thalamus in our consciousness discussions, and as we hopefully remember from them, thalamus is a kind of coordination center where you have nuclei of many pathways which are responsible for transmitting sensory information from the periphery to the cortex, and then the motor signals from the cortex back to the periphery. And midbrain and frontal lobe are areas of the brain. They have multiple functions. Like, for example, frontal lobe, usually it's responsible for the executive function, for cognitive abilities. Midbrain has many roles, including coordinating not just cognitive things, but basic bodily functions. Like, for example, temperature regulation, heartbeat regulation and stuff. So this study identified that we, again, like with the verbal processing, cannot find a clear distinguishing pattern which would hold along all of these studies, because as you can see, many of them found different things. So yes, so it appears to me that most of these functionally observed differences might be related probably to the effects of hormones and to the social aspect, but we cannot find a clear morphologic pattern which would distinguish men from women on the brain level.
That's the end of the presentation, am I correct?
Yes, yes, you are. So I can return back to the discussion now.
Yeah, so for those who are new to this group, we often do the lecture and then we just hang out and talk about it and ask questions. So feel free to unmute yourself, and I would say feel free to just speak up and interrupt each other. And if that gets too chaotic, then we'll go to raising hands, but it usually doesn't. So what thoughts do people have?
Many of one of my biophysicist colleagues who taught at Wright State was enraged by the self-deprecating and self-defeating behavior of her female graduate students, which she noted as a class. Her group was largely composed of women, and a majority of them showed this, this sort of tendency, which is again a demonstration that this might be learned behavior.
Yes, I think that's a good point. But the problem with it is going to be very hard to test out. Like, how are you going to, you would have to have experimental groups of kids, and you would have to, like, what are you going to do? Tell their parents to raise them a certain way, but that's human experimentation. So I guess the only way would be to just analyze data after. Like, we wouldn't be able to do experiment, but we would be able to do the analysis of, let's say, if that child was raised with more
Well, there is a certain amount of research on gender differences on outcome. For instance, your own experience with grants might line up with this. One bright point is increasingly people are finding out, across gender broadly, what kind of success rates people have, on fairly objective indicators of, research success.
Yes, that's true. But I also have to say that in my field, in biology, women now, I think, are prevalent among the graduates. It might not still be present on the level of like tenure professors, but that's simply because it takes some time to
I agree with your observation. Biophysics is largely female now, not at the most senior levels, but it's largely female.
Yeah, so what I think is that in like last several decades, women started being more interested in these fields. It had already produced the difference observed on the level of graduates, but it hadn't yet come to the level of professors. So that would be my take on that.
Yeah.
Hello, yeah, this is Baram Sharuz. Thanks for the excellent presentation. I'm a professor at UC Structural Engineering. I learned a lot from this. One of the things I've learned over the years, I've had the pleasure of having female grad students as well as male grad students. One thing I found that the differences, my female students, how they approach to solve a problem, very elegantly different. And it was a very eye-opener. And what I started doing, if I had the luxury of having a female student doing structural engineering research, I always tried to pair them with another male student. And that was, I think, the best of the two worlds. I think these, to me, I'm not obviously into biology, but it looks like biological differences, societal factors lead to these differences. And I think the message that I get from this is we really need to combine both male and female, if possible, to take advantage of both areas. That would be the best of the two worlds.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is a really good take on that. I also think that, now a lot of people nowadays discuss different ways of like get rid of biases at the workplace. But what I would say is that why wouldn't we just overall take sex, race, and name out of applications? Like when you are applying for a job, for anything, you submit whatever objective meritocratic criteria are out there. Like, for example, you submit your test scores. You submit, when I was applying for grad school, that was obviously English test scores, that was GRE general scores. There were like GPI, there were like certain measurable parameters. And I don't think it even should be required to like list your inborn parameters, which you have no control over, like sex or race or whatever ethnicity. I don't think it's necessary.
I agree with you 100%. That's the way it should be.
Because like this is not relevant to who we hire for these roles. Like that would actually create a perfectly blind process for hiring like the best capable candidates.
Yeah. The lack of, I wouldn't say lack of confidence, I guess the tendency of being completely perfect about, like what you said about, rewriting your proposal, 20 times before you submit it. I found that among my female colleagues, they are not as self-assured as my male colleagues. Men tend to just shoot from the hip, whereas women, they're very calculated. They really want to make sure, at least that has been my observation. What they say.
As the one study showed, men are hasty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, it also might be like cultural differences, because I can very well say that there's probably exactly the same pattern. Like I wasn't raised in America. I was raised in a culture where self-flagellation is very acceptable and is considered a gold standard of practice. So maybe in me, it's less of being a woman versus having the origin I have. So that's another thing. Like people from different cultures might exhibit different behaviors. Like I never can write recommendation letters, even like draft recommendation letters for myself, because I just can't do that. It sounds nasty to me to like self-advertise, but there are other people who are more confident with that, and they market themselves as if they were marketing someone else. So
I have some Russian male colleagues who are amongst the most aggressive people I ever met.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I once had the pleasure of being a co-chair for a session that included Deryagan. And, I've never met a personality closer to a Stalin tank than that.
So, let me interject the chat question that came in a minute ago. So Michelle was asking, is there any difference? She says in cell size, but I'll broaden it. Are there any morphological differences in brain cell or network or any of that we know of between the genders?
No, this is not present. In fact, if you look at if you look at not even cell size, but if you look at MRI, and it would not tell you what is the overall brain volume, people wouldn't be able to tell which it belongs to. So it's similar for the kidney. The female kidney cell size is same as in males, but the overall organ size is larger.
Cool. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
I have a question. It concerns whether these spatial differences, rotations, and so forth, can affect other forms of thinking. For example, theoretical thinking. Can you abstract from these differences in spatial abilities to differences in any kind of abstract thought? Some people say they think geometrically. In my field, which is logic, there aren't very many women. And logic, certain kinds of logic, like mathematics, involves manipulating spatial propositions on a page. Seeing what follows from another is a matter of syntactic form. You see this pattern and you make deductions. And people say that the flow charts are a way people think about space. Neural nets is a metaphor. So do you think these spatial differences affect more abstract thinking?
I would think yes. I agree with you that sometimes abstract thinking would involve elements of spatial reasoning, but at the same time, not definitely, not always, because like even when you're doing an abstract thinking section of an IQ test, not all of these, some of these things are more spatial than others, I would say. Sometimes the logic behind this can be inferred from the spatial things, but sometimes it's more like a color.
Sure, sure.
I would say yes and no. I would agree largely on what you said, that logical thinking requires at least interest to spatial analysis.
Well, there's a branch of research now on logical manipulations of images instead of propositions. That's making inferences on the basis of pictures and so forth. I don't know where it's going, but it's new, you know.
Have you seen any changes over time? Like you said that in your field there is not that many women. Have you seen that over time there would be changes in that trend?
Well, it's been philosophers have been around for 2,000 years, and many different cultures, and women don't tend to gravitate to it. No, you know, there are a few fields like math and philosophy and of all things theology, in which women are not very well represented at the more advanced levels. It's curious.
I think what also might be underlining this is like when I myself love philosophy, particularly the classical civilization. And I particularly like debating about that with Christians, because Christians love to say how everything what they've created never existed before. But actually, if you look closer to the Greek philosophy, you would find almost every single Christian concept in there. For example, the concept of Trinity already was present in not even Neoplatonists, but earlier. But what I would say is like when I was a teenager and then more older girl, like when I would say that I like philosophy, people would say that, well, this is boring, you're never going to be married and stuff like that. So here then the problem comes down to like how are you responding to society not accepting your interests? For me, it's very simple. I just dumped Russian society. But I think a lot of people would prefer to fit in the roles. Like they would think that if it's believed that women shouldn't do philosophy and it's going to make them boring, and they would be like too authoritative to get successfully married, then it's better to like something like fashion dolls. So I think what it might come down even more than spatial reasoning is like fight or flight response. to like challenge. I think that more women and men would prefer not to fight, but to kind of adhere.
I just want to put out a very strong vote for marrying intelligent women.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but
Just saying.
in our advanced developed world, yes, but in worlds where people have more like agricultural economy,
Even there.
yeah, but you know, there people have tempers which say that women should be obedient and not very smart. And the smarter they are, the worse the outcome for marriages. So what I would say is that it's kind of not advertised to be set up for women. Mostly because most philosophers are men. There are few examples of women, but some of these examples are tragic. For example, we discussed the story of Hypatia of Alexandria, who was like brutally murdered by the Christians. And well, it's again, like for me, this kind of examples, they cause different response. Like, for example, when I heard about Hypatia being murdered by Christians, I'm thinking about the Second Amendment and its importance. While most women would think that probably they should stay at home and not be noticeable so that they wouldn't get murdered, you know.
Well, it's certainly true.
that kind of stuff.
In the tradition of Western philosophy, anyway, the argumentative stance of participants is sort of built into the culture. And in Plato, you have the dialogues. In the Middle Ages, you have disputations. And in modern times, when you conduct readings or defend papers in philosophy gatherings, you are attacked. And that's expected. And it is true that women in philosophy seminars have a harder time engaging in that, I think. Yeah.
I think it's a very correct observation. Yeah, I see that also in our science discussions. However, I would say among scientists, these differences are less prevalent because I think scientists are more like their own kin than they are like the rest of the humans.
Well, I've noticed this when I go to paper readings in other departments. And I try to find a vicious flaw in the paper and ask a question about it. And sometimes it's really impolite. It's not expected. Yeah. You're not supposed to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not supposed to do that, but you better do that before the paper gets published. then someone else is going to find a flaw in your study when it's too late, and you'd have to retract the paper, and that's going to result in like many negative consequences for you. So I would rather get trashed now. We even have saying in our world that like you better get trashed in the lab meeting than you get trashed later when your paper is already out there and everyone
I once had a colleague who I observed making a vicious attack on a speaker, and then he and the speaker going out to have a beer together later. And when I asked him about it later, he said, "Scientists don't get even, we get mad."
Yeah,
that is, we can be that
people might have tournament, like they might, have like fight as a part of the tournament, but then they can go out and have beer together.
Yes.
So I'm totally fine with that. When I was at the medical school, I've been inviting on purpose. Like we had like two most vicious people who were known to like come and trash all presentations they attend. And I was always inviting them to my talks so that I can hear what they have to say, and then my next version would be better.
Smart.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I would say my conclusion would be this is a combination of pubertal hormonal changes plus societal influences. Because based upon all of these studies we looked at, there is like very small morphological differences, because like obviously there are systems of organs where differences are not quantitative but qualitative, like for example reproductive system. Like there it's not about weight normalized to overall weight or something, they're just different organs. In some other organs you have higher differences, like for example in thyroid gland and the heart. But in the brain, it appears that these differences are the smallest among all of the organs, and the structural differences are just not identifiable, while we have the functional differences and we have the observed test differences, which means that it must be something else but morphology.
Are there any studies to look at premenopausal and postmenopausal differences?
I will have to look it up, but that's another good question, because this might change after the menopause. However, that would be very hard to discern from age-related differences. Like there would be another variable. So that's worth exploring, but I don't think it was part of the paper which I presented.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you expand on the phenotypical differences in women and men regarding emotion? That went by pretty quick. There are these tests on the SAT that will tell you about math and language skills, but what are the what are the demonstrated differences in emotional ability?
In terms of, you mean not just like which areas of the brain?
Right, right. In terms of behavior.
Well, in terms of behavior, actually, it might be very related to what we talked on the very first slides. I would say that this figure summarizes them up very well, because it appears that both men and women do have emotions, but they just respond to their disturbances with different behavior patterns. Like, for example, for women, it would be more often to more prevalent to have an eating disorder, while for men, excuse me, pardon me, it would be more typical to have alcohol use disorder. While I would say that the void behind the two of those is similar, because it's obviously internal unhappiness, insecurity. So, but if women would compensate it with either starving themselves or abusing the food, men would do it via alcohol use.
But I do think
these are rather indirect. I mean, signs of emotions like anger and joy and disgust and so forth are, you know, people say men are more prone to get angry. I don't know.
I definitely know from the studies I looked at that women are more prone to get anxious. Like anxiety and depression are more common among women. Anger, I don't know. It's like acute response or long-term response. Like, how do you define anger? Do you mean anger with immediately getting into the fight or plotting a long-term revenge? I would say that men are more likely to do the first, while women are more likely to do the second.
Valeria, am I correct in recalling from your presentation, though, getting to the morphological differences, there weren't any on the emotional section?
Yes,
correct?
yes, it is a correct assumption. They observed that the areas of the brain which get activated are more the same among.
Much the same.
Yes,
So
they're
it's
much
more
the
about
same.
how we deal with it.
Yeah, I would say it's how we
Present.
deal with that, and how sexes deal with that might be related to what are their physical capacities. Like, a woman can't succeed much if she gets into direct fight, but she can succeed if she plots a long-term revenge. So that might be underlying, you know, the anger, so-called anger differences. And yeah, so I would say that. And you know, eating disorder, it's probably very relevant to like societal expectations about beauty standards, because for eating disorder, it's not only bulimia, but it's also anorexia, where women just stop eating and they want to make their shape perfectly thin. But it appears that alcohol is more typical for men, at least now.
I'll drink to that.
Yeah.
I wanted to make one comment regarding like kids' toys. So my son was born like 4 years after my daughter, and the whole house was full of girl toys. When my son started crawling around, he found the one truck that was there, and he just ignored all the girl toys. So I think there's something in that.
I'll
Yeah.
give you an anecdotal counterexample. I was amused one day when my son was walking through a toy store and he picked up a toy gun. And it was very clear he had no earthly idea what that thing was, just by the way he was holding it and looking at it. And I enjoyed that moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what is important is that you expose a child to many different types of toys. And I think it's okay if they still select whatever is stereotypically supposed to be for one sex or another. I don't think that you need to like restructure people without a clear goal to do this. But if they select the toys which are, for example, more spatial oriented, like Legos or construction blocks, or we even looked up the action figures. There are apparently action figures made in shape of the founding fathers, and I think we're definitely getting that when we have kids. So I think Legos, yes. I think it's just important to like expose a child to many different activities and let them select what they want for themselves.
Yeah, I think there's a reason certain things are stereotypes, because there's a large percentage of individuals who fall into that stereotype, but then
Yeah, I totally
for the
agree.
stereotype, but then we have to obviously, make sure that those or try to help those who don't fit that stereotype not feel excluded.
Yes, I agree with that, but I also don't think that we should try to like resocialize those people who do fit into these stereotypes, because society still is dependent on reproduction. However, I've seen there was this research from England. It appears that they've created human embryos from the human stem cells, which is a remarkable breakthrough if you think about that, because it completely changes the paradigm. It was believed that only gametes can make a new creature, only fertilized gametes. But then there were studies which showed that even single-sex gametes can make new embryos and new creatures. Then there was an next breakthrough, and they showed that you can even have an unfertilized female gamete, which is just epigenetically induced, and it develops into a new creature. But now this is a completely paradigm shifting result, that you can get post-implantational embryos, not even from the gamete cells, but from basically somatic stem cells. So I would say that if at some point humanity moves towards being like multiplanetary civilization, which just reproduces from its own pool of stem cells, then all of these gender roles will become like whatever, dinosaurs or things of the past, which are just totally unnecessary today. But I think they're still necessary in the way society functions as of right now. So I don't think that we have to like forcefully resocialize people. It usually happens in times of war, but then it happens not for a good reason, but just out of plain necessity.
Okay, we have a hand up. DR?
Yes, it's Joe.
Yeah, Joe, thank you for that. I was.
Oh, let me turn my camera on. I'm still in bed, but sorry.
If you wish.
Okay, or either way. But Valeria mentioned, if I didn't catch her wrong, that her solution to Russian societal expectations of her was to just dump Russian society, right?
Oh, no. It was that like I decided that if in Russia they want me to like not be a scientist, not be interested in what I'm interested in, I'm just gonna change this society. And, I'm gonna go to a different society which has different standards. But it's like I was giving that example as a part of like fight or flight example that like
Yes, I related to it because I think the similar thing happened to me, and I've seen it a lot in non-Western societies where women who are educated in STEM in those societies end up not being able to work within their country and move out of the country. And it adds to the conversation. I was trained in medical anthropology. I took a mental break because I went through absurdism, existentialism, and nihilism. So I feel like women feel a lot of pressure, um, having to fulfill very much strict gender expectations, and at the same time, being the pride and joy of newly westernized families. So it's kind of hard to navigate all of that, and a lot of us end up just moving out of the society altogether, which leads to a giant brain drain. Like
100.
my brothers, yeah, my brothers are also intellectuals, but they didn't feel comfortable marrying intellectual women within the society because they were too hard to deal with. And a lot of them ended up marrying more traditionally village women. And there's a reputation for women like me to be married to Westerners. Oh, she's going to marry a European. Oh, she's going to marry an American. Like it's almost
Yeah, I totally get it. I 100% understand. That was very similar to how it was in the times when I was a teenager. But, it's like these countries, they are the enemies of themselves. Like they create these situations and then they get the brain drain, then they get worse outcomes, and then they blame other countries for that.
exactly.
But, this is not how you deal with that. Like this is a woke approach to blame others for your problems. Like if these countries want to create these gender roles, they have to accept that the net effect will be that certain people will leave. You get what you pay for.
Yeah, because right now I'm in business. I'm still figuring out how to reintegrate the social scientific community and where my place would be in there. So to take a break, I just created a business to sustain myself and have time to actually observe society from the outside. Because I studied Simone de Beauvoir, and her relationship with Sartre was just weird. But yeah, but basically, there's a lot of people who are still stuck in those societies, and I'm working with them, helping the best I can. But it's still the problem of like, we are still being pushed out. Like, I know Rihanna, who's just a pop artist, tried to go to my country and do a concert. Like, the locals boycotted her. She couldn't go.
Oh my
So,
God.
yeah, so this conversation is just having my head spinning in society and sociology and biology, because there's a biological component, but trying to actually I don't know, clarify what is biological when all of us are moving out of those countries, so the data becomes very hard to like cross-cultural study. I think is becoming really hard when people are just
I
moving.
understand. I agree. I
Yeah.
totally agree with that.
Wait, Joe, where are you from, if I may ask?
Um, Technically I'm French, but my family is Senegalese. So when I was very young, they decided that they didn't want me to be too Western. So they moved me to Senegal to be educated there in a French system, but in a very much patriarchal, conservative, not patriarchal in a good way. Actually, I'm not pro patriarchy or matriarchy. There's something called the balanced complementarity. But
Yeah,
yeah, so like my society was very much patriarchal. So it's not just me, it's actually a big, I think in sociology that's something we need to talk about more, that new generation that's caught between those two kind of the man and the woman, fulfilling those norms and at the same time uplifting their culture or their nation into development without actually tackling the root problem, which is those values that we're not really letting go of. So
yeah, I
yeah.
agree that there is a certain generation which is kind of trapped between like new opportunities but still present old standards. And I totally hear what you're saying.
Yeah. So just confused. That's all. Figuring it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for speaking up.
Yeah, all right. It was a very nice meeting, and if that's all, then we can.
Well, I have a question, a
Oh,
quick
sure.
one, about transgender people. If the brains of men and women are essentially the same, and differences emerge later in puberty from things like hormones, then transgender transition seems possible without by just hormones. Do you have any views about differences between how this kind of research affects the issue of people who identify with the gender different from the one they were assigned at birth?
Yeah, so my take on that would be probably deemed by some people as rather conservative. I don't think that there is a thing as male or female brain. So I know that's a very popular motto among certain people, that they are trapped in the wrong body. I don't think it's possible. Because what do you mean that you're trapped in the wrong body? That like your brain doesn't correlate to your secondary sexual characteristics, but that's just called gender non-conforming people. And again, like all of that is purely based on society, because we know that in prehistoric societies there was no such thing as like gender stereotypical roles, because everyone was hunting and gathering, and
I
all
doubt that.
roles came from like later times, to the point of like how they exist now. Because think about it, if your society is very basic, if everyone is just doing food collection and protection, you cannot afford a certain sex to just stay at home and do childcare, simply because the population depends on the work of each and every member of it. So it's kind of logical what I'm finding from the prehistoric human studies, that like there were both sexes involved in hunting, not just men. But when the societies became richer, they started being able to afford that woman stays at home and the man goes to work. And as a result of that, we get all of these stereotypical behaviors. So from the medical literature, which I read, so there is two classical types of transgender patients. One is very young kids, like preschool age, 4 to 5, who from very beginning start showing signs of incongruity between their feeling and their body. That's one traditional category. And there is a second traditional category, which are, according to the reviews I read, mostly middle-aged men who want to transition into women. And that had been known like for decades. That is a very well established category of patients. But if you look at the data, it appears that now a lot of the new transgender identities are among the teenage girls. And I think that a lot of that might be related to just what we just talked about, that there is this current generation which is kind of trapped between the two poles. One pole is that women have opportunities. They can now do science, do space, do military, do pretty much everything.
It's a lecture.
Yeah, but at the same time, there is this expectation that women will still be primary caregivers for the kids and for the family. And these two, you have to take efforts to make them going together. Like, yes, with modern technology, with, childcare, you can outsource a lot of these functions, but they still eat up a large chunk of the person's life. Like, for example, breastfeeding. Yes, you can incorporate that into your workday, but it's going to put hurdles on you. So I think that a lot of young women, they're kind of trapped in between these two. And I think that they believe that they might be transgender because when they think what the woman is supposed to be, they see mostly these traditional feminine caregiver person who is like, maybe she has a job, but it's a part-time job or like something very, superficial. And they think that if they want to do science, that means that they are men. So that's my interpretation of what is going on right now. But
I would say I think what you're saying exists. I also have become convinced that there is a concept of gender that a person can have that doesn't match.
yes,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, and I don't think we necessarily understand the cause. It's like, I lost my train of thought there. I do think that a gender identity not matching your sexual assignment is a thing that also exists. And I think we know less about it at this point, but
then my question becomes, from the materialistic perspective, what is that identity? What is its nature? Because if you think about that, and I've been thinking about that very carefully, this idea appears to be very similar to what the Christians would say, because they would say that this is your brain stuff, this is your nervous processes stuff, but aside from that, the person has a soul. And that soul is not related to anything what the science can detect. That's not related to brain structure, that's not related to organs, that's just the God-given essence of the person, and the body is just like the clothes. So then if this is the case, then there needs to be an answer of what is the material nature of this identity. Like what
I think it's okay that we don't know that yet.
Yeah, but then it needs to be questioned.
People thought that being gay was purely a state of mind, and I don't believe that's true either.
But the thing with gays is that gays were known from the times of antiquity. I recently reread so there is Plutarch, that's an author.
I agree with that, but
yeah, so they were
would
saying
then begin to look for evidence of there are cultures that have different definitions of genders than the standard Western world that have
but that doesn't mean that sex doesn't exist, because basically I think that the only way how I can know that I'm a woman is based on the chromosomes. Because as we just discussed, like if you take my fMRI and compare it to the fMRI of a man, you wouldn't be able to know one from another without knowing the overall body size, without knowing the overall brain size. But that doesn't mean that there is a certain structure in the brain which discerns men from women. And then the question is, what is this identity based upon? Because I have a strong feeling that
something we have not yet figured out.
Maybe, but I think that what it might also be in large extent is that it's like internalized gender stereotypes. That the person thinks that if they don't fit into traditional gender,
I believe that also exists. I think what you said is also a thing that happens.
Yeah, because like gays, so there is a huge difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. Because sexual orientation is what you want, who you want to be your partner. Like that's more like I want to be a doctor versus I want to be an engineer. While identity is what you think you are. But the problem is that it depends on how you define the sex. And I here I'm being consistent with atheism. I don't think that humans have some immaterial identity which cannot be defined in biological terms, because if you accept that concept, then you also have to accept the concept of soul. And then, then the whole anti-abortion argument becomes valid, because then if you can say that, well, we have identity which is not material, then they can say, but then how do you know that fetus doesn't have that identity? What if this identity is present since the times when the zygote is formed, and you're not going to be able to disprove them, because the only way to disprove them is applying to biology, to material nature of human development. But if
this has all of this has political implications, these conservatives who want to identify to prohibit transgender moves based on your sexual organs don't have a basis for this division if you think about the brain. If there's no brain difference, that's much more fundamental from the point of view of this issue about whether there's a natural law separating men and women in society. This is very interesting.
You know, it depends on how you look at the person. Like, the person is not just their brain, right? And I think that basically now the society came down to the point when men and women are no longer segregated in the areas where it's primary about the brain, when it's primary about cognition, you know, because today men and women can do same jobs. There is no such thing as women are not allowed to do these jobs on the grounds of their intelligence. But you know, the thing is that despite not being a thing as male and female brain, there are clearly male and female chromosomes. And if you look at the structure of these chromosomes, which are different, you'll find that it's not only about sex. There is a lot of genes out there which are affecting many other functions. And the problem is that people cannot change their chromosomes. And this is something very fundamental. Like, this is not just like some internal unimportant thing. Basically, the chromosome and its structure is what determines our individuality. You know, you have different features because you have different combination of genes, and these genes are material.
That's the sex definition. John Morowitz, you had your hand up for quite a while. I'd like to give you a chance to project.
Yeah, too many things were going on, so I'm taking us back a little bit. But I would say, yes, you can't change your chromosomes, but you can change your life and life choices. And part of that is an individual, part of that is all the organizations and people we deal with. And those are two different things. In terms of access for women in various fields, I think lawyers, law schools now, I think are maybe more women, but it's 50-50. I think that medical school is that way. Engineering is not. Mathematics is not. Is that because of biology? I think there may be a component of that, but I think overall it's much more the way those organizations deal with women. And as I posted on the chat earlier, for math, what I've heard is that in grade school, girls do very well, but somehow that changes in high school. And is that because of chromosomes? The fact that the age changes tends to me to say that it's much more the way that they're treated in school, or the way that how they're dealt with in a math class or overlooked or something along those lines.
Thank you. But we also know that hormones are encoded in chromosomes, right? So if you have, so the way sex hormones are, they are synthesized from the same precursor. So androgens and estrogens, they are synthesized from the same precursor hormone. But these hormonal changes which happen in high school, they're also encoded in the chromosomes. So you can't say that there are chromosomes and there are changes which people undergo in the high school. These are actually two connected things.
Okay.
And
how does it affect a math class differently than a history class or a biology class? I'm sure that, yes, there are those changes, but how does that affect performance in one class or another?
You mean performance which favors women or which favors men?
Favors men. That's what studies have shown. But
well, that people have different proclivities. Like, maybe more girls are interested in other sciences rather than maths. And
I think also the studies have shown, though, that girls often get overlooked. The boys are called on, or there's various other ways.
Yes, that could totally be the case as well. It might be a combination of both, but I don't know. Like, maybe it's because I'm from the country where it was traditionally considered that it's very important to challenge everyone with maths. And actually, most of my math teachers were women. And they like what you say to me sounds very unusual, because in the school I was in, it wasn't a thing that anyone would be overlooked. On the contrary, if women would want to do maths, they would probably be encouraged to do so. But this is the inheritance of the Soviet culture. Now it's very quickly changing back to more traditional approaches. But I mean, Sweetie Pie, like when you were in your advanced math class, have you ever been overlooked or something?
No, not at all.
Yeah, so my wife she was in the AP maths, and I think you were not in like some special school, you were in like regular governmental school, right?
That's right.
So she was in the governmental school, and it doesn't appear that there was some like attempts to like track her down. I think where it might likely be coming from is family. I would think about family more likely be willing to like say that the daughter should not choose these fields. But you know, that's about culture.
Well, with a grain of salt, I hope you appreciate this as the grandson of a mathematician whose daughter, my mother, was a mathematician also. She said, of course, there are few women. Who wants to hang out with a bunch of nerds?
Exactly. You know, that too, maybe women like more fields which are kind of like brighter. You know what I mean? Like clothes design, things like that. And math.
Okay.
Math is rather like it. I really like the input of that person who spoke about the verbal capacity, not the verbal, but spatial capacities in pertinence with logic. That, you know, maybe since women have a little bit worse of the spatial reasoning skills, they choose math less because it would take more effort to do it.
So do I have to also put out a call for marrying intelligent men as well? Intelligence is sexy, y'all.
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree.
I regret that I have to leave the discussion at this point. Thank you, Valeria. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And as long as these are all the questions, then I think
Yeah, we're winding down about, we usually
perfect.
last an hour and a half or 2 hours generally.
Yeah,
So unless
well,
someone has a burning question left, I suppose we can call an end to it here.
yeah, thank you very much for coming and for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much for presenting.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everybody has a great day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.